Hey there, it's Matea. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bookends today. If you've been enjoying our show, it would be a huge help for us, and I think also for you, to follow us on your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever app you use to listen. This will ultimately help us make more Bookends episodes and connect you with more of your favorite authors. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks so much for listening. Hey, welcome to Bookends. I'm Matea Roach. You may have heard of Brat Summer or Hot Girl Summer, but this one was new to me. Have you heard of Rat Girl Summer, just R-A-T? Its mantra was to stop overthinking and to embrace a rat-like energy by laying out in the sun and nibbling on little snacks. That message of embracing simple joys and shunning societal expectations was a theme in Emily Austen's latest novel, We Could Be Rats. It's about two sisters who struggle to understand each other as they reach adulthood in a small conservative town. Younger sister Sigrid is a 20-year-old lesbian and high school dropout who very deeply resists the idea of growing up. She would much rather spend her days indulging in snacks and avoiding her obligations. But there's none of that rat girl energy in her older sister Margaret. She goes off to college and conforms to her parents' and society's standards. In We Could Be Rats, we follow these two sisters as they grapple with some dark realities and test the bonds of their relationship. Emily Austen lives in Ottawa and joined me from the CBC studio there. Just a note to listeners before we begin, our conversation today touches on suicide and addiction, so please listen with care. Hi, Emily. How are you?
Hi, Matea. I'm good. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
We Could Be Rats, to me, was a fun title for a novel. And you've said before that you were actually daydreaming about some of what I was describing of becoming a rat and living that kind of unburdened rat-like existence while writing this book. Were you all in on Rat Girl Summer? Where did this rat idea come from for you?
I was watching Charlotte's Web, the animated version. I think it might be from, I want to say the 50s. I don't know when it's from, but I was thinking of Templeton the rat, who goes on a veritable smorgasbord in that film. So I was channeling that energy.
Your novel deals, though, with the heaviness of existing as a human in the world. And I think, this rat energy comes from a place of maybe wanting to escape some of those burdens. What is it, do you think, specifically about becoming a rat that appeals to Sigrid, one of the characters in this novel?
I think rats are such an endearing creature because they, anyone who has rats, I don't, because they don't have a very long lifespan and I don't have the heart for that. But anyone who has them always says that they're a lot like dogs. They can learn tricks. They have big personalities. They are sort of thought of negatively and have a sort of gross, connotation to them. But they're just little creatures, and they're living for themselves and they're scrappy and I like them.
Mm. I mean, that feels very apt, I think, for Sigrid, the character who's kind of talking about rats and ratness in this novel. Before we turn to some of the plot and kind of character dynamics that we see, I've been talking about this kind of Rat Girl Summer in a light tone, but We Could Be Rats actually has a lot of quite heavy subject matter in it. And I would say you have this signature style where you write about darker topics with some levity, with some humor. How do you balance those two things in your writing? Like, is that something that you do deliberately? Is it something that comes naturally to you?
Whenever I start to write a book, I always tell myself, I'm going to write a funny book. That's always my intention. But then I always end up, my characters end up getting, extremely depressed or having some severe challenge. So I think the balance is actually, it's easier for me to write sincerely when I write with some humor. And I think the reality of existence and the reality of even dark things like having mental illness is that there is humor. There's something funny to certain parts of that. And if you want to write about that experience sincerely and with, earnesty, the reality is there is some humor to it.
Why do you think it is that you need to inject humor in order to get to that place of earnestness as a writer?
I think, it would be hard for me to write something that is fully humorless and be truthful about it, because I think there is humor in everything. I also think, just realistically, reading a book, for me, I want to read something that balances the humor. I couldn't endure just reading, pages and pages of sadness and darkness without at least a little bit of something to cheer me up in there.
Mm-hmm. We Could Be Rats, you mentioned mental health as one of the themes that gets delved into in areas you explore. It also delves into sisterhood, growing up, and that kind of early adulthood transition from being a teenager to being in your early 20s. There's also stuff about addiction in there. What was it about these themes and these themes together that you wanted to explore?
Well, whenever I write a book, I like to think about my own experiences to a certain extent. So my first book was titled Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead, and it's about a atheist lesbian woman who stumbles into a job at a Catholic church. And I wrote that partly because I was raised Catholic, and I thought, okay, I'm going to pick Catholicism as an ingredient I sort of have in my cupboard here. When I wrote this book, I was thinking about, I grew up in a small conservative town. I have two older sisters. I have this experience where a lot of the people who I grew up with have struggled with, or a family who struggled with opioid addiction. So I was picking at some of my experiences and mixing them together to try to write something, and this is what came out.
In terms of the format of this novel, I definitely felt there was, I will say as a reader, I could tell that this was coming out of a place of, okay, probably there are aspects of this that come from lived experience and aspects of this where there's the license of the writer that's being taken. One of the things that you did that was really interesting was the structure of this novel, where it's divided into these three sections and you're switching between these two sisters, Sigrid and Margit. And the first section is called Sigrid's Note, where each chapter is framed as one of Sigrid's attempts at writing a suicide note. I'm wondering why you wanted to open your story in this way.
My previous two novels are both written in first-person present tense. And so when I was writing those characters, I was writing what they were thinking. There was no... there's no barrier between you and that character. I wanted to do something different with format in this book, but I still like being in the head of the character. I'm a character obsessed writer, I guess. I'm interested in knowing what someone's thinking. But I thought I could play a bit with structure with this, so rather than write it as first person present tense, it's written in letter form, and that gave me some creative license to do some things differently. When you're writing a letter, you have an audience in mind. And so I was writing this character thinking partly this is her writing. It's not her thoughts. She has people in mind who she wants to read this, and it sort of makes me think about the character differently, and it was sort of a fun, creative change.
Mm. Well, one of the people, I would say the person who's the most in the audience for this suicide note is Sigrid's sister Margit, right? She's often speaking directly to Margit in these notes. She and her sister are very different people. What sort of sisterly dynamic did you want to create here?
Yeah, so I was, one thing that I'm interested in is thinking about how two people can have the exact same childhood and experience the same childhood trauma or, even the same nice things and still come out very differently and have a very different, be impacted differently. So part of what I was trying to do with these characters was show that. I also, Margit is this sort of, the way she responded to their childhood trauma was sort of that their parents were angry and hostile and in some cases violent and abusive. And Margaret responded to that by being sort of hyper vigilant. She was, the type of person who notices when there's a slight tone change in someone's voice. And Sigrid, on the other hand, is someone who, finds it exhausting to pay attention to that sort of thing and is sort of recklessly living for herself. And so I wanted to, use this book as a way to explore how sisters interact with each other and what it's like to have a sister and how sisters know each other. And, one of my hopes for the book is that you would read it and feel like you get what it's like to have a sister.
I'm wondering, because I think a lot of people who have siblings can probably relate to this experience of you grow up with someone, they're there for a lot of the same events as you are. They see your parents all the time in the same way that you do, and yet they come away with a completely different opinion of what it was like to grow up in your household. It can be very jarring, I think, sometimes, if you realize that your perception is not shared by someone who you expect to kind of back you up on certain things. Why do you think it is that siblings can be raised in the same household, the same environment, experience some of the same traumas, and walk away with completely different feelings about what happened and different opinions on like the actual truth and facts of certain things that their parents did, for instance? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think that's one of the benefits of having a sibling, because I think that is an experience that almost everyone with siblings has, where you remember something and they say, I don't remember it that way, or I don't think that was their intention. And having that experience growing up helps you understand that we're all, existing in a different way. And even in the exact same circumstance, we might come out of it with a different perspective, which I think is one of the benefits of having siblings. You understand what it's like a little bit. It's easier for you to understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes and to understand perspective differently.
Is that something you feel like you've experienced with your own sisters?
I think to a certain extent we're pretty aligned in a lot of ways, but there are definitely, there's definitely some stories where I'm like, no, that's not what happened.
Yeah, no, I have 3 younger siblings, and I think for me as the older sibling, it's more there are things that I remember because I just was older when it happened. And then I'll be talking about some moment that was very formative for me as a child, and my siblings will be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like that, it's just, maybe so, but I don't remember. I was 3 years old, so sorry that happened to you, I guess.
For sure. I think age also has an impact. I have a little brother too, and I feel like the years between us have made perception different too. I think there's this strange thing that happens with age.
Is your brother much younger than you?
About 5 years, and my sisters and I are much closer in age, so we're all like a year or 2 apart. So he was the little boy among 3 older girls. Yeah,
that can make it, especially when you're young. I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Emily, I want to return a little bit to the characters in your novel, to Sigrid's suicide notes, that opening portion of the novel specifically, because again, as we were talking about before, there's this kind of like trivial, almost joking tone where there's play with the truth, there's jokes made about heavy moments. She talks about not really being unhappy, which feels hard to believe because there's this undercurrent of course, she's writing a suicide note. I'm wondering what you wanted to convey about Sigrid and the way she experiences life through that tone, specifically in these notes.
Yeah, so originally I was thinking, okay, this is going to be an upbeat suicide note. That's what I'm going to try to write. And what I was trying to convey in that was Sigrid's intention, which was that she didn't want to make people feel bad. I think something I was trying to explore in this book are perceptions people have around suicide, particularly in terms of selfishness or, not having compassion for other people or caring about your family who are impacted. Sigrid's writing this note with like an intense concern for the impact that it will have on the people around her. And I also wanted to write, sort of similar to what we were chatting about before, the reality of being mentally ill isn't necessarily, even if you're suicidal, it isn't necessarily that you're sitting crying in the rain on a cliff. You know, there is still, people are not, the perception people have around what it means to be depressed, for example, is not always accurate. And even depressed people can, treat things trivially or find things funny, or, it's not. I wanted to show, at least for Sigrid's character, what the truth of being in that mindset is.
Mm. Why do you think it is that people still have this idea of suicide as something that necessarily must be selfish?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's partly that there's a lack of understanding regarding what it's like to be in that mindset. I think it just is, in mental health in general, I think that we've made some improvement in our society regarding like destigmatizing mental health, but it's not, it's still handled sort of at an arm's length. I think of, when you work in an office type environment, for example, you might get emails from your employer about how mental health is important. But the reality of being someone who actually struggles with mental illness, like if you went into work and you said, oh, I was sick because I had, a mental health crisis, I think in many places, the reality in our society is that you would still be received poorly. You would still be seen as perhaps, dramatic or lazy or sort of lying, or, there's still this, we give a lot of lip service to what it's like to be mentally ill, but there isn't a real sincere understanding of it in a lot of ways, I think. Obviously there is for some people, but I think there's still a lack of true understanding.
Sigrid has this belief that she espouses throughout the novel, that life gets worse as you get older and that your most joyful days happen when you're a kid. She has this very vivid recollection of childhood, remembering, this is the structures that I used to build with my toys in the basement. And these are the sorts of like silly games that I used to play as a teenager. And this inevitability of adulthood and the fact that adulthood just, if you live to a reasonably old age, represents such a larger chunk of your life than childhood does, it seems to create this real sense of doom for her. Why does she feel this way?
Yeah, I was trying to write someone who, as a kid, for example, she didn't want to become a teenager. She was the type of kid who, played with her toys longer than the other kids, who wasn't interested in, talking about boys, for example. And then she had a similar sort of crisis when going from teenager to adult. With her, I was trying to show that her sort of authentic self is someone who, I think she says something in the book around something like, I feel like a happy person caged. I think I wanted to write her as someone who has this disposition that is positive and who wants to be happy, but who is affected by the society and restrictions imposed on her as someone who is a queer person living in a small conservative town who people find rude and annoying because she doesn't understand social graces very well. I wanted to show how stifling that is for someone whose natural state, had she been born as a rat, she would have been a happy rat, even, as an adult rat. She would have been someone who was living for herself and happy. But because of the world she's living in, she's not able to be her true self. And when she does, it doesn't feel happy. She doesn't get that rat girl energy. She feels depressed.
Emily, one thing that you mentioned briefly earlier was the theme and kind of presence of opioid addiction in this novel. And one thing we learn in this book about Sigrid is that she has this like profound shame around this best friend, Greta, who we learn is dealing with an opioid addiction. And we kind of never see the impact of that on Greta, but we see how the loss of this friendship and knowing that her friend is suffering affects Sigrid really profoundly. Why does she feel this sense of responsibility for her friend who's dealing with addiction?
Yeah, so one thing I was exploring in this book is the importance of connection and community. And so one difference between Sigrid and Margit is that Sigrid is pretty isolated. She didn't graduate high school. She's in her small conservative town. She has conflict with her family, and her one close friend it has an opioid addiction, and they're no longer friends. Margit, on the other hand, has moved away to college. She has friends. She has, a school community. Her teachers notice when she starts to struggle in class. She has people around her who notice her, and Sigrid doesn't. And that was part of what I was trying to convey in this story is to show what it's like to be someone who cannot connect with the people around them because they are, for example, queer in a community where they cannot connect with other people. And I also, with Greta, the reality of small towns is that there is an opioid epidemic. And I wanted to show with Sigrid, she and her friend both tried drugs together. And Greta fell into this opioid addiction. And I think if you're from a community like that, or if you have any experience with someone who has an addiction problem, you know that there is that people can behave the exact same way. People can make the same choices, and one person will be an addict, and then they have to suffer the social stigma of that while their life disintegrates and while they struggle with this horrible illness, and they're sort of seen as someone who is this rotten person. But the reality is that so many people around them did the exact same things, and they don't have, I don't know what it is, they don't have the gene or something. They're not addicts. So I also wanted to explore that a little bit, for the sake of understanding what it's like to be someone like Greta in this book.
What is it about the small town in particular that makes it sort of a tense location for people that are living on the margins in some way, whether that's because they're queer, whether that's because they're addicts? Because these are also issues that happen in cities, but I think that they happen in large cities very differently than they happen in towns, such as the one you're describing in your novel.
Yeah, I think there is a different sort of culture to these smaller communities. I think there's less community is part of it also. Like there are less people, like I'm in Ottawa right now, for example, there are like safe injection spaces and things like that. And when I go to smaller communities, there might still be those things, but on a significantly smaller scale. There's less support. There are less people who maybe have experienced, having a friend or a loved one who has an addiction. So there's ignorance around it. I think it's a different sort of thing, and I think it specifically festers in those sorts of communities because they don't have the social structures in place to support people the same way you might in a larger space. And particularly when looking at spaces where people feel like they can't, they don't fit in, they don't have community, they can't escape, sort of. They might turn to things like, substances in some way, a little bit more maybe, but I don't know. I'm not an expert in it.
I mean, maybe not an expert in the sense of not being somebody who studies this, but I think you mentioned earlier having the experience of having grown up in a smaller community yourself and knowing people who've struggled with addiction. One thing about the town in your novel, and I'm not sure if this is also true of your hometown, but there's this sense of economic decay and sort of deindustrialization that's very present, that there don't seem to be jobs available for young people either at all, or the jobs that are there are not well paying. It made me think quite a lot about the way that the Rust Belt gets talked about in the U.S. and the way that certain parts of Southern Ontario that I have friends that, come from there, have family from there, get talked about, where there used to be, for instance, like auto manufacturing or large machinery manufacturing. There now isn't. And then there's this kind of vacancy where young people are left adrift. Is that something that was on your mind at all when you were writing this novel?
Definitely, yeah. So I grew up in St. Thomas, Ontario, which isn't the place that I didn't overtly set it there, but it's definitely somewhat inspired by that. St. Thomas has changed a lot, and the population has grown. But when I was younger, we were really impacted, and they still are really impacted by the auto plant industry. Like the Ford factory closed. It was, there was no one who wasn't in some way affected by large auto plants closing. Like he was either their dad or their next door neighbor, their best friend's parent. And that also impacted so much because it was this community where, people worked at these factories, their children would work at those factories. It was it was this huge vacant job space. And to a certain extent, that's still, the impact of that is still reflected in that community. But yeah, so I was definitely thinking of that. Of that.
I think, in another way in which this sort of small town environment comes into play in your novel is there's this real sense that there are certain expectations that people who grew up in Drysdale, the community in your novel, are expected to meet. Sigrid, as somebody who is queer, who has a little bit of an offbeat personality, I think really feels that she can't or doesn't want to meet some of those expectations. The idea that girls and boys are going to date, they're going to get married. In small communities, often they're going to get married relatively younger than in big cities. You get a job, you start a family. There's these certain markers of adulthood that you're expected to just do. But at the same time, Sigrid is observing that her own parents are in an unhappy marriage. Her sister, who did really well in school and went off to university and is the kind of golden girl of the family, also doesn't seem that happy. And there's this kind of veneer of we're all play acting at being good community members in a way. I'm wondering why people grasp onto these conventions at times, even when it doesn't serve them. Like, why is it, for instance, that characters like Sigrid's parents feel like they have to stay in this marriage where they are screaming at each other all the time and are constantly having to send their kids over to an aunt's house so that the kids are not seeing it?
Yeah, that's, I think that's one of the perks of being queer is that you're sort of disillusioned to some of that. Like you, especially, if you're someone who was really affected by things like compulsory heterosexuality, and you recognize in yourself that you're gay, for example, a lot of our social expectations, it becomes very clear that they don't actually serve people. And, it's so ingrained in us that we're going to do certain things. And we're, humans like, I appreciate I remember finishing school, for example, and thinking, oh no, I don't have something that I'm working towards. And something nice I find about writing books is there's this sort of like, now I'm going to see the cover and now I'm going to do these edits and there's a pattern to follow. It's nice to feel like you're working towards something. But obviously the script that we've been given, or this pattern that we have been given, wasn't necessarily defined with our happiness in mind or with necessarily our best interest in mind. And for a lot of people, the prescribed route in life definitely shouldn't be that you lay down picket stake fence posts and marry a guy and have a bunch of kids. That might be very miserable for a significant portion of people.
I mean, and that's not to say, I suppose, that there aren't people for whom that's good. Like, I went to Catholic high school, right? And so I definitely have friends that got married, like, pretty young. I have a couple friends that are 26 and having kids, and that's fine. I'm 26. I'm thrilled to not have a child right now. Like, it sounds like it would be terrible. I'm wondering, you mentioned far earlier in our conversation that Catholicism is something that was really present in your first novel. And it's something that's present in this novel as well, where Sigrid and Margit did go to Catholic school, I assume, like Catholic public school. Their parents are Catholic. Catholicism seems to really infuse the politics of a lot of the characters in the novel. What do you think is the role of Catholicism in upholding some of these social scripts? Like, is that something that you were thinking about as you were writing?
Yeah, I mean, I was also, that's that's also the reality of the community I was from, where, you know, there's a significant portion of people who are Catholic, and so the prescriptive route in life is sort of written by that. And I totally, there are lots of people who are so suited to being moms or parents or whatever, and that's what they really want, and that's so good because it's their authentic self. But there are a lot of people who, because of Catholicism and a number of other things, that are negatively impacted and made to feel like they need to behave and live a certain way, and one day they're going to wake up and feel like, you know, the horror of, you know, we're alive on this planet and I've made these choices that are not actually aligned to what I genuinely would want, and you feel sort of like a fraud. I think Catholicism is particularly bad for that, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. You've written a poetry collection before called Gay Girl Prayers, which reclaims Catholic Bible passages, you know, to, I guess, empower women and empower queer people who have not historically been centered or respected in the Catholic Church, I would say. And then, as we've mentioned, your first novel centers around a lesbian who's an atheist who nonetheless takes a job at a church. I'm wondering, for you as a queer author and as somebody who grew up Catholic, why do you feel it's important for you to bring queerness and Catholicism together in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people necessarily have to do this, but I'm someone who wants to write about things I know about, that I have some experience with. And that is something, you know, I sort of have a hyperfixation on Catholicism for a long time. I was very, you know, I studied religious studies in university, for example. I read the Bible. I was very interested in the history of the Bible and very interested in Catholicism. I think that's just something I have something to say about. You know, I was in many ways very negatively affected by going to Catholic school, for example, and being taught certain things that I now realize are very restrictive or homophobic or, you know, sexist or what have you. And and I have something to say about it.
Yeah. I guess if you don't mind my asking, like, how do you feel you were negatively affected by that?
I was someone who was, I mentioned compulsory heterosexuality before. I was very deeply out of tune with my true self, I think, for a significant portion of my youth, I guess. I was someone who, had I not been deeply interested in examining my thoughts about this, I think I would have woken up and been married with 10 Catholic children. I was very affected by that. I'm someone who, you know, I appreciated certain aspects of it, especially as a kid. I was a kid with anxiety and existential dread, and it's nice to be told, well, guess what? If you behave like this and you do this, when you die, that you're going to be all right, and everyone around you who you're so worried about, don't worry. If they do this and this and this, all the good things will happen. And so I think in a lot of ways I sort of clung to it, and the foundation of all my choices and beliefs was sort of built on Catholicism in many ways, and I don't agree with a lot of it. I don't agree with a significant portion of it, I would say, and I worry about the impact that it can have, especially on young girls in terms of purity culture and many things.
Emily, you mentioned before you're inspired to write about things that you've gone through in your own life. You have this sense, I feel, you know, throughout your work and throughout this conversation, of really wanting to live an examined life and delve into topics that you feel like you have some experience with. Do you feel that you've gained anything personally in reimagining some of your experiences, including some experiences that were perhaps painful or difficult, through a fictional lens?
Definitely. I think that's one perk to writing for me. I feel like I can make something positive out of things that I found negative. I think writing is great for that. I think art in general is great for that. It's nice to be able to, make a bad experience into something good. And I've really found, especially with the poetry in that first novel, that I have been connected to people who had similar experiences and who, had, it's, and I was just talking about how community and connection matters so much. It's nice to be able to turn that into something that you can connect with other people over.
Emily, that feels like a nice note to end this on. Thank you again so much. It was such a pleasure talking with you today.
Likewise. Thanks for chatting.
That was Emily Austin, author of We Could Be Rats. She joined me from the CBC studio in Ottawa. This episode was produced by Liv Pasquarelli. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Shout out also to our audio tech, Marco Luciano, and to the entire CBC Books team. We could not make this show without them. Just a heads up for any writers listening, this is the last week you can enter the 2025 CBC Nonfiction Prize. The winner will receive $6,000 from the Canada Council for the Arts, a 2-week writing residency at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, and have their work published on the CBC Books website. You can head to cbcbooks.ca for more information and to find out how to enter. The deadline is March 1st, and we can't wait to read your work. If you enjoyed that conversation, you might also like my interview with the Canadian writer and poet Zoe Whittle. Here's a sneak peek of that.
I think it feels like there's a culture of not admitting how profound that loss is, that romantic loss can be life-changing and altering, and it can really impact the next few years of your life. And I think that what was interesting and difficult about what I went through was that it really did feel like all the messages you get about heartbreak involve, you should just dust yourself off, pick yourself up, go back out there. And my experience of trying to quote unquote go back out there during that time was, it wasn't useful. And I think that part of the decision to write the book was also the fact that I was wrestling with just allowing myself to be alone and to really sink into the good parts of kind of leading a bit of a solitary life.
You can head to the link in the description to catch the rest of that conversation. And don't forget to hit the follow button so that you won't miss any of the fantastic guests we have coming up on the show. I'm Matea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.